Throughout human history, we've always looked to the stars for answers to big questions like, why are we here? Or where did we come from? And oftentimes people will take this a step further and try and infer things about people's personalities. Like, for example, if you're a Taurus, you're more likely to be compassionate. Or if you're a Taurus, then somebody's going to disappoint you this month. Now, while those things are up to personal interpretation, turns out that there are actually real physical forces that act on the Earth that originate in outer space. And these forces create tides. When most Charlestonians picture tides, they imagine these sprawling, shimmering, beautiful waters of salt marshes and these different Spartina patches throughout it. And then when you picture a low tide, you imagine the stink of decomposition and all these oyster shells exposed. Unfortunately, these tides aren't always confined to natural systems. They can encroach into our cities and cause scenes like you see here. And while we all love living next to the ocean, living in it is a different story. All objects that have mass exert an attractive force on other objects surrounding them. That's what we call gravity. The larger the mass and the closer the two objects are, the stronger the gravitational pull. It's important to keep in mind the role that distance plays in this equation, because that's the reason the moon's role in creating tides is actually larger than the sun's, despite the sun being so much more massive. As you can see here, this guy has 4 moons orbiting his beer belly, and the doctor suggests shedding some mass so that they'll drop out of orbit. So how does this gravitational force create tides? On the top, we have what we call spring tides, and this is when the moon and the sun align on the same plane and their gravitational forces act in the same direction. It's during these occasions that we're going to have the largest tides and when you can expect to see flooding in Charleston. On the bottom, we have what we call neap tides, where the moon and the sun are at a 90-degree angle relative to the Earth. It's during times like these you're going to see the smallest tidal ranges. That means both the smallest high tides and the highest low tides. So I know this slide is a little bit intimidating, but on the top here we just have your standard tide table. You can find it simply by Googling Charleston tide table, and if you take one thing away from this talk, let it be how to understand this. So you can see that there's 2 columns, high and low, and within each of those columns there's an AM and a PM column. That's because in Charleston we have 2 high tides and 2 low tides every day. This is not necessarily true for every other region of the Earth. In fact, the East Coast specifically is known to have these cycles, and we call them SemiDiurnal. On the bottom here, it's the exact same representation of this same information, just laid out in a different way. So we have tidal height on the y-axis, and you can see that it follows a consistent wave pattern. And if you isolate one day on there, say May 5th, you can see that there's 2 peaks and 2 troughs. That's the 2 high tides and 2 low tides. And this actually has an interesting part to it. It's predicted tides. So this purple line that you see over here is actually what we know the tides are going to be, within a certain degree of uncertainty. So how do we predict them? Well, it turns out that the distance between the moon and the Earth is the biggest determinant in the magnitude of these tides. And I know on this slide it says full moon is when the moon is closest to the Earth, but the phase of the moon and the distance it is from the Earth are actually not linked. So full moons are not necessarily always when the moon is closest. And the moon's orbit is actually elliptical, which means that it's going to be closer during some parts of its orbit than at others. Instead of worrying about how close the moon is to the Earth, it's best just to keep an eye on tide tables. By 2045, we're expecting to see greater than 180 days of sunny day tidal flooding. That means no rain, no storms, just from tides. Every other day there's going to be flooding. So keep an eye on those tide tables and do everything you can to prepare. Thank you. Good job.